mean, I spent many years as a journalist doing these kind of interviews, so I kind of know the form. And I think we're all, if I'm speaking to myself as a journalist, we're all guilty to some extent of misrepresentation because we're looking for an angle or a line to take. But this went way beyond anything I'd come across before, certainly in a so-called respectable newspaper like the Times. I mean, in fact, Jordan Peterson was extremely articulate. Perhaps, you know, as far as I was concerned, well, I don't know if he's back to his old self, but he certainly didn't sound like the person that he'd been portrayed as in the article. The article portrayed a situation where his daughter was constantly standing over him, telling him what to say and do and think almost, which wasn't the case in the slightest. And by the end of it, and once I'd thought about it, I was really shocked. I was really shocked. I've done something I never do, which I've written to the editor of the magazine. I've written to Decca herself. I've written to the managing editor of the Times, so I know. Just expressing my dismay that it's come to this. I mean, I'll finish in a minute because I don't want to take up all the space. But you know, the more I think about it, the more I feel once again that it's not even malice beyond the normal bounds of journalistic malice, which is very much a way of getting attention when you're a journalist. I've done it myself, to my shame, I would say. But when I was much younger, it seems more to me what David, I think, originally described as the glitch in the matrix, is there's a complete misunderstanding here. And not only a misunderstanding, but an absolute determination not to understand what this man is and what he's trying to say. Of course, avowedly, the interview wasn't meant to be about who he was and what he was trying to say. It was meant to be about his health, as I understand it. That was the brief. And had it just been about his health, then I think it would have been, notwithstanding the many distortions within that, that would have been fair enough. But of course, it wasn't. And the idea was that somehow his so-called propensity for telling men to man up, which as far as I'm concerned is not at all what he says, had rebounded on him and caused him to have essentially a schizophrenic breakdown. I did use the word schizophrenia in the article. Now, I can't speak as to his health or its causes, the causes of his ill health. And I did find the whole journey he's been on peculiar, hard to understand, and open to a lot of questioning. I certainly think that he's probably, well, one is left to suspect as one possibility that he has not been able to cope psychologically with the pressure that was on him, which would be a perfectly reasonable response from any human being, given having met him 3 times now. He's a genuinely sensitive man. You know, he's not this alt-right thug. I mean, it's just nonsense. And I genuinely feel sorry for the guy, which also informed my response, because I think he's been through such a terrible time. And I think that really shocked me with when I read the interview and realised and came to understand the level of malice in it. But finally, I don't, as I said at the beginning of this, I'm not even sure it's about malice, except the normal reflexive journalistic malice in this case. It's more a case of just utter incomprehension. And the reason I think it repels so many people, particularly who think in a certain, shall we say, modern left vernacular, is his concentration on personal responsibility. And I think that's what throws the spanner into the works for so many commentators who might otherwise be sympathetic towards him. Because it seems to me the left don't really have a language for personal responsibility anymore. They did once, and now the focus is always on groups. But individual responsibility, which is a much more complicated and challenging idea, seems to threaten people. So that's my take on it, David, as far as I've got so far.
Yeah, and there's a few pieces there to come back to. Two quick things I wanted to cover that you brought up, because I think one of the things that seems to have been most upsetting was this sort of seizing on the schizophrenia point, which if you listen to the conversation, they're saying his symptoms were so bad that some of the doctors, one doctor I think even suspected that it was schizophrenia, which was obviously ridiculous because it doesn't kind of afflict people at his age with no previous symptoms, and it was clearly the drugs. And it was said in a very, and for that to be sort of taken up and the line to be he was diagnosed with schizophrenia is just clearly misrepresentation. You can just about get away with saying that, but it's really stretching the truth. And it seems to that's one of the pieces that people seem to have said is really unfair. The other piece was the sort of almost like very casual invocation of toxic masculinity, which the irony there, and I think this points to a lot of the catch-22 situation that I've noticed with the men's work that I've done, and the whole dynamic and the whole conversation around masculinity is, could you imagine this kind of treatment of if Jordan Peterson had been a woman. Like, could you imagine an article that said a broken woman and had gone in, like in the aftermath of what had happened to him over that period? I can't imagine that being the case. I just don't think that any newspaper or any media organization would run that. I think that somehow, and this is the catch-22 that I've seen so much in our men's retreats, is men being told to be more honest, to be more emotionally open, to be more vulnerable, which Jordan Peterson has been very emotionally vulnerable. He cries a lot. He talks about he wears his emotions on his sleeve, and to be kind of attacked for that, like I see this catch-22 so much, to basically say, men, you need to be more vulnerable, more honest, more emotional, and then when they are, to be attacked for that. No, you're taking up too much space. Like that is such a paradox, and I think the point into that toxic masculinity just, to me, highlights these kind of double standards that we have in the culture around that.
Yes, and to pick up on that momentarily, David, I think it's a very long thread after the article in the Times, universally pretty much attacking Get Craig and head in the Times for running it. But a few of the people talked about toxic femininity. Now, I don't have a view on toxic femininity. I don't know if it exists, and I don't have a view. But I do think it's interesting, the idea that, if, as you said, it would have been unthinkable if Jordan Peterson had been a woman to be treated in such a callous fashion. Similarly, I don't think if Decorating had been a man, that she could have got away with calling his daughter a pouting Barbie blonde, for instance. I think that sort of thing will be entirely beyond the pale. So there's very clearly several things going on. One is a kind of denial. One is a kind of double standard. A third is a kind of journalistic practice, which I'm not familiar with, but I've only really come to understand lately, which is, well, I don't know to what extent this was preconceived, and even now will be conceived in the Times editorial offices and by Decca herself, despite the massively negative response, as a positive thing, because it's been clickbait. And these things thrive now on controversy. And she may have well set out to think, well, how do I get this thing the maximum profile? That I think is a very sinister development. And I think it's taken over what was once the quality press, in the way that once that was the preserve of the gutter press. People like the Mail and the Sun quite nakedly paraded their prejudices and interweaved opinion with news, and certainly their features. But I think outlets like the Times and the Observer and the Guardian were always, while hardly innocent, were much more careful about that, and certainly had writers who would go out of their way to present a balanced picture of a person, however controversial they happen to be, and make an attempt to understand that person a bit more comprehensively. And that's really what I found depressing, because it's not this. This isn't a one-off, is it? I mean, it's a trend. It's a tendency. It's a corruption of mainstream media.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the statement that he put out afterwards that he talks about that. He talks about the interview with Kathy Newman and the interview with Helen Lewis. Like he basically says his strategy so far has been just to speak the truth as best as he can and let the chips fall as they may. I would still say that there was a real difference in his demeanor in those two interviews. In the Kathy Newman one, which felt like a kind of there was a layer of, like, it was combative, but there was also a layer of sort of almost good humor below that he certainly demonstrated, and the one with Helen Lewis was very, very different, and I think he was in a very different place at that point. But what's really interesting as an observer, there was a time where Jordan took on CAA, who are a big agency in California, and a lot of people said, oh, he's now got media handlers, he's being controlled, or he's got this sort of infrastructure around him. And the striking thing is how little of that he has had from the beginning. As someone with his level of celebrity, to engage with the media in the way that he has is very unusual, and to engage not just with the media. There was that big scandal with the photograph that was taken off him in New Zealand with the guy with the Islamophobia t-shirts. Like, that would never, like, if he did have media handlers, if CAA were treating him like they would treat sort of a celebrity, a pop star or someone like that, that would not happen. Like, that happened and seemed to happen on a fairly regular basis. Kind of speaks to his strategy, for want of a better word, but also I think a sense of deliberate. I go back, actually, the other article was the one in the New York Times, The Custodian of the Patriarchy, where that journalist, Nellie Bowles, had actually approached other people. I know she'd approached Brett Weinstein before, and they'd talked to her off the record and had basically come to the conclusion that she was going to frame them as being men's rights activists and had an agenda, and decided not to talk to her. And and Jordan pretty much invited her into his home for 3 days, and then what came from that was was certainly a very angled piece, if not an outright hit piece. And that's been striking. And I don't know whether it's incredibly admirable or it's incredibly naive or it's both. I'd be interested as someone, like I've worked in the media, I've worked in newsrooms, but I haven't done like feature interviews, profiles in the way that you have. So I'd be interested if you've got any thoughts about what that process involves and whether you think that, do you think that's naivety, or do you think that's sticking to your guns and allowing the media to expose itself for the games that it plays?
I like to think that it's idealism. I think he's passionate about this idea of standing on what he thinks and what he believes. And it's also naive because I think, here's a good analogy that someone once described to me, which is that if you go on television without any makeup, you don't look real. And you kind of need a bit of makeup to bring out your natural contours. And that's a lesson he might well, without giving up any of his integrity, do well to consider. I mean, I think when you're as smart as Jordan is, I hesitate to use the word arrogant, because I don't think he is arrogant, actually, but he knows how clever he is. And I think he's determined to do things his way. And I do admire the fact that he's not got some oily media manager, keeping away from anybody who might portray him in a bad light. And that's pretty admirable. But at the same time, he's serving up nice, juicy meals to those who are hungry for him, and if I were him, I'd certainly give that some consideration, and be realistic, and I don't think that necessarily leads to him selling himself out.